The emperor forbade sorcery, yet one of his brightest sons drowned in it. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, sought salvation in knowledge and found only damnation in its depths. His fall was not sudden, but inevitable, for in the Imperium of man, every truth is a curse, and every flame of brilliance becomes fuel for the abyss. In the endless expanse of the galaxy, where the stars are nothing more than cold embers in a void that has devoured countless civilizations, there is one figure whose name lingers like an unhealed wound across the aeons of mankind. He is Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the Cyclopean Sorcerer, the most brilliant and most damned of the Emperor's sons. His story is not one of triumph, but of inevitable ruin, for no brilliance, no loyalty, and no love could withstand the poisoned weight of destiny that the galaxy places upon its chosen. Magnus was not born, as mortals understand birth. He was crafted, a fragment of the Emperor's own will, designed not merely to lead armies, but to peer into the fabric of reality itself. From his very inception, Magnus was unlike the other Primarchs. Where his brothers were warriors of unmatched strength, generals of fire and steel, Magnus was a vessel of knowledge, a living conduit of the warp's shifting tides. His form bore the unmistakable mark of otherness, his skin flushed crimson, his single great eye blazing with unnatural light, his frame towering even among giants. To look upon him was to sense the unsettling touch of powers that mankind was never meant to wield. He was both majestic and terrible, a figure sculpted for a role that would bring enlightenment or damnation. When the Emperor's enemies tore open the veil of creation to scatter the Primarchs, Magnus was cast into the warp and hurled across the stars. Unlike his brothers, he did not arrive on a world of simple warriors or feudal kings. He descended instead to Prospero, a planet where knowledge was the highest currency, where the people had already turned their gaze toward the mysteries of mind and spirit. There, among scholars and mystics, Magnus was not feared for his gifts, but revered for them. In a galaxy that would have called him a mutant, Prospero called him a god. It was here that Magnus built his kingdom. He became philosopher king, sorcerer architect, master and guide to an entire civilization that hungered for knowledge. His people, the Prosperine, elevated psychic study into a culture, shaping libraries of thought and halls of learning that rivaled any treasure forged in stone or steel. Yet beneath this enlightenment pulsed the warp, subtle and poisonous. The Crimson King taught his people to harness their psychic potential, to weave flame with thought and sculpt reality with will. They became scholars, but also sorcerers. And in the shadows of their progress, demons watched. For in the warp, every flame of knowledge draws the gaze of hungering predators. Magnus knew this, but he believed himself capable of shielding his people. He believed his mastery could outwit gods. This was his first and greatest sin, pride. Pride in believing that a mortal mind, even one carved by the Emperor, could master the sea of madness. Still, on Prospero, Magnus thrived. When the Great Crusade reached his world, the Crimson King bent knee willingly to the Emperor. He did not resist the truth of his origin, nor the destiny placed upon him. He became one of the most loyal sons, embracing the vision of a galaxy united under reason, progress, and the rule of the master of mankind. Yet even in loyalty, he walked a path his father despised. The Emperor forbade the use of sorcery, decreeing psychic arts as perilous and corrupting. But to Magnus, sorcery was not a vice. It was the very essence of who he was. To deny it would be to deny life itself. And so he pursued it, quietly, stubbornly, believing that his father's disapproval was born not of wisdom, but of fear. The 1,000 Suns, his legion, mirrored him in all things. They too were cursed and gifted, born with psychic talent that tore their minds apart as often as it elevated them. The flesh change haunted them, a mutation that warped their bodies into grotesque abominations. It was a fate that promised extinction. Only Magnus, through sorcery, was able to halt this creeping death, to shield his sons from dissolution. To them, sorcery was not forbidden, it was salvation. The bond between Legion and Primarch became unbreakable, forged not in steel but in shared damnation. Thus Magnus strode across the stars, a figure of brilliance and dread. To those who saw him upon the battlefield, he was a titan of flame and lightning, tearing apart entire armies with gestures of his hands, rending the skies with psychic storms that could annihilate tanks, fortresses, and men by the thousands. To his allies, he was a scholar whose counsel promised wisdom. To his enemies, he was a terror in crimson flesh. Yet even among his brothers, Magnus was set apart. The other Primarchs whispered of him, wary of his sorcery. Some despised him outright. Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, saw only corruption in his brother's craft. Mortarion, the pale Lord of Death, reviled sorcery as nothing but weakness and deceit. Even those who did not condemn him regarded him with unease, for Magnus represented not only power, but temptation, the lure of the warp, which promised infinite strength at the cost of one's soul. And still, Magnus loved his father. In his heart, he remained true to the Emperor, convinced that his work, his pursuit of knowledge, his mastery of sorcery, was for the good of mankind. It was this loyalty that would prove his undoing. For loyalty, when coupled with hubris, becomes the cruelest chain. When the Emperor left Terra to construct the secret Webway project, Magnus believed himself indispensable. He sought to warn his father of Horus's treachery, to reveal the seeds of heresy festering in the War Master's heart. But to deliver this message, Magnus turned to sorcery of a scale so vast that it shattered the veil of reality itself. He hurled his mind across the warp, tearing through wards the Emperor himself had laid, and in doing so, he broke the webway. The Golden Throne faltered, the Imperial project collapsed, and demons spilled into the Emperor's hidden sanctum. Magnus had sought to save his father, and instead, he doomed him to an eternity chained to the throne. This was the moment where loyalty became betrayal. The Emperor, in his fury, decreed Magnus's punishment. The wolves of Russ were unleashed, not to censure, but to destroy. Prospero, jewel of knowledge, became a funeral pyre. The 1,000 sons were slaughtered in their halls, their libraries burned, their people turned to ash beneath the fangs and claws of Fenris's legion. Magnus watched it all, his heart torn between guilt and wrath. He had begged his father for understanding and received only the executioner. He had sought to serve and was cast down as a traitor. In the crucible of Prospero's ruin, Magnus made the choice that sealed his fate. He called upon the warp not as scholar, but as supplicant. He bargained with Tzeentch, the changer of ways, and in that bargain, he surrendered what remained of his soul. From that moment on, Magnus was no longer simply the Crimson King. He was the Crimson Sorcerer, a being bound to the architect of fate, his eye forever turned toward the schemes of demons. His body, once noble, grew monstrous. His gifts, once meant to uplift, became weapons of corruption. The man who sought to save mankind became its destroyer. And yet, beneath the demon's shadow, fragments of the man endured. Magnus still wept for Prospero, still longed for the father who had cast him aside. His tragedy is not that he was evil, but that he was broken, torn between love and hatred, loyalty and damnation, until the warp claimed every piece of him. The galaxy remembers him not as savior, but as heretic. And in that lies the cruelest truth of all. Magnus's greatest sin was not betrayal, but hope. For in the 41st millennium, hope is the most dangerous heresy of all. The burning of Prospero was more than a campaign of war. It was a ritual of annihilation. It was not only the warriors of the 1,000 Suns who perished, but the culture, the knowledge, and the very memory of a civilization that had sought truth through the lens of forbidden power. Entire libraries, built across generations, were reduced to smoke and cinders beneath the howls of Fenrisian wolves. The scholars of Prospero, unarmed and defenseless, were cut down as though their books and scrolls were weapons more dangerous than blades. The city of Tizca, jewel of Magnus's reign, became ash adrift on the wind. And in this ruin, the Crimson King's soul fractured. He had seen the truth of Horus's betrayal, had sought to prevent it, and in his attempt had been branded traitor. He had seen his father's dream, the golden ideal of a unified mankind, and had believed in it more deeply than most of his brothers. Yet he was condemned not for rebellion, but for loyalty expressed in the wrong form. His failure was not one of defiance, but of faith. Such is the cruelty of the galaxy, that even devotion becomes damnation when filtered through the prism of destiny. As the wolves of Rus tore through Prospero, Magnus watched from afar, bound by pride, despair, and inevitability. At the height of the carnage, when his legion lay shattered and his city engulfed in flames, he chose to act, not to resist, but to surrender. He bent knee to the architect of fate. To Tzinch, he gave his soul, and in return, he was granted survival for himself, and a twisted salvation for what remained of his legion. But such bargains are never without cost. The Crimson King ceased to be a man of flesh, and became instead a creature of the warp. His once noble form grew monstrous, a reflection of his inner torment. His skin, already crimson, burned with sorcerous fire. His single great eye blazed like a beacon into the Imperium. Wings stretched from his back, feathers shifting with impossible hues, their colors never the same when looked upon twice. He had become the very thing his father had warned him against, a demon prince, chained forever to the designs of a god. The 1,000 Suns, spared extinction, were remade as well. Tzinch's gift was cruel beyond words. To end the curse of the flesh change, the changer of ways bound their souls to dust. Within their armor, they became hollow, their bodies reduced to ash and fragments, their spirits locked in eternal prison. No longer men, no longer living, but automata of sorcery, the rubric marines of Prospero. Their voices fell silent, their laughter and anguish extinguished. What remained were warriors of eternal obedience, bound not by loyalty, but by spellcraft. Magnus's legion was saved, but it was a salvation more damning than death. This was the final irony of Magnus's existence. His every attempt to save those he loved only damned them further. He sought to protect his sons from mutation, and instead, he erased their humanity. He sought to preserve Prospero, and instead, he reduced it to dust. He sought to save the Emperor, and instead, he chained him to a throne that devours 1,000 lives each day. Every act of loyalty ended in destruction. Every act of hope birthed ruin. And so the Crimson Sorcerer withdrew into the Eye of Terror, carrying with him the fragments of his broken legion. On the planet of the sorcerers, a name as twisted as the world itself, Magnus built his throne. The warp twisted Prospero's ruins into something both magnificent and terrible. Towers of impossible geometry rose from seas of shifting glass. The winds themselves whispered with voices of the damned. Here Magnus ruled not as a king of men, but as a demon prince of Tzeentch, architect of schemes that wound through centuries. Yet even in his demonhood, Magnus remained torn. Unlike many of his brothers who had fallen into the embrace of chaos, he did not revel in his corruption. Fulgrim sought perfection in damnation. Angron sought slaughter without end. Perturabo forged endless engines of hate. But Magnus wept. Magnus remembered. Magnus mourned. His soul, though bound to the changer of ways, clung still to the dream of a galaxy built upon knowledge, not slaughter. It is perhaps for this reason that Tzeentch's grip upon him was all the more insidious. The architect of fate does not devour outright. He whispers, he nudges, he twists. And so Magnus's grief became another chain. His longing for what was lost became the lever by which he was moved across the great board of fate. In the millennia that followed, Magnus became a figure both pitied and feared. To mortals who encountered him, he was a god of flame and vision, a towering cyclopean demon whose voice could shatter sanity, whose presence could unmake reality itself. To the Imperium, he was the Scarlet King, arch-heretic, embodiment of the Emperor's warning against sorcery. Yet, to those who know the deeper truths, Magnus was also a man broken beyond repair, cursed not by rebellion, but by inevitability. The Imperium's histories paint him only as villain, for in the dogma of the High Lords and the Inquisition, nuance is heresy. But the Forbidden Chronicles, the ones whispered in the corners of ruined libraries and demonic archives, remember him as something worse than a villain. They remember him as a tragedy, for to be a villain is to have chosen evil. To be a tragedy is to have been destroyed by forces one cannot resist. There are moments in the endless darkness when Magnus speaks, not to his legion, not to demons, but to himself. Witnesses, driven half-mad, claim to have heard his words carried on the winds of the warp, laments for Prospero, for the Emperor, for the brothers he once loved. Some claim that in the depths of the warp, Magnus still dreams of reconciliation, of finding some way to undo the ruin of history. Others whisper that these are illusions placed by Tzeentch, mocking him with shadows of hope that will never come to pass. In truth, none can say, for the warp devours all certainty, and still, the galaxy burns with his shadow. The 1,000 suns march at his command, their rubric marines silent and unyielding, their sorcerer leaders weaving schemes that ripple across sectors. Worlds have fallen not to armies of steel, but to Magnus's sorcery alone. On battlefields, his presence is a storm. Tanks unravel into molten slag, fortresses collapse into shifting glass, and men turn upon themselves as madness grips their minds. He is a god of war and despair, not because he delights in it, but because it is the only language left to him. Magnus's tale is not finished, nor will it ever be, for time itself bends in the warp. To look upon his story is to see a spiral, forever looping back upon itself, repeating the same pattern of pride, loyalty, ruin, and regret. The Crimson Sorcerer cannot escape his fate, because his fate is his very essence. His sin, his punishment, his power, and his tragedy are bound together in an endless knot. And perhaps this is the most terrifying truth of all. Magnus the Red is not the exception, but the rule. In the 41st millennium, there are no heroes. There are only figures who struggle against inevitability, and in their struggle become instruments of greater horrors. Magnus's brilliance did not save him. His loyalty did not protect him. His love did not redeem him. All were devoured by the same darkness that swallows all things. For in the grim darkness of the far future, even gods are broken, and even kings weep. Magnus the Red, bound now as demon prince of the changer of ways, did not vanish into the eye of terror as a forgotten relic. His presence grew like a festering wound upon reality, his schemes bleeding into the galaxy with the inevitability of decay. The planet of the sorcerers became his throne, a world not born of matter, but of shifting madness, remade in Tzeentch's image. Mountains rose only to dissolve into rivers of liquid glass. Skies burned with colors unnamed by mortal tongues. Towers stretched higher than reason permitted, their spires reflecting endless copies of themselves across horizons that bent into impossible geometries. Upon this world Magnus presided, a king of ashes and dust, his throne surrounded not by courtiers of flesh, but by rubric husks and sorcerers who bartered sanity for whispers of truth. The 1,000 suns, once a legion of men, had become a legion of silence, their hollowed forms clattered with each step, their armor animated not by muscle or will, but by binding spells. Around them moved the scarab occult, sorcerers who yet retained voices, though each word they spoke carried with it the echo of the warp. They were Magnus's children still, but no longer his sons. They had become shadows of what they once were, echoes of men, vessels of power, instruments of schemes. To gaze upon them was to know despair, for one could see in their stillness the truth of Magnus's greatest failure. He had saved their bodies only by erasing their souls, and yet they worshipped him. For Magnus remained their father, their savior, their king. In his presence, they bowed not out of fear, but out of loyalty still lingering like embers in the ash of their existence. This was perhaps the cruelest cut of all, for Magnus knew that he had not given them life, but eternal slavery. He had not preserved their humanity, but annihilated it. And still, they followed. Still, they obeyed. The burden of their devotion weighed upon him like chains forged of sorrow. As centuries bled into millennia, the Imperium spoke of Magnus only as traitor and demon. To the ecclesiarchy, he was the scarlet abomination, proof that sorcery was heresy beyond redemption. To the Inquisition, his name was a curse invoked in secret rites of fear. To the common man, he was no more than a whispered myth, a towering cyclops of crimson fire who haunted the dreams of the guilty. But to the Adeptus Astartes, to his surviving brothers, Magnus was something more intimate. He was the reminder of what pride could cost, of what happens when even loyalty becomes twisted into betrayal. He was both warning and prophecy. There were times when Magnus returned to the stage of the material galaxy, his presence shaking entire sectors. At the Council of Nicaea, long before Prospero burned, he had argued for the use of psychic power, pleading that it was mankind's next step in evolution. Now, as Demon Prince, he returned not as supplicant, but as living proof of the Emperor's fears. His sorceries tore through worlds. Planets fell not to armies, but to his will alone. Fortresses dissolved into rivers of molten stone. Void ships vanished into vortices of impossible fire. To fight Magnus was not to fight a man, but to resist the warp itself given form. Yet behind this power, there remained grief. For every world that burned at his hand, fragments of Magnus wept in silence. He had never desired conquest for its own sake, nor slaughter for the pleasure of it. Unlike Angron, who drowned his soul in blood, or Fulgrim, who reveled in decadent corruption, Magnus did not delight in his damnation. He endured it. He wielded it because he must, because it was all that remained. And that endurance, that refusal to abandon grief, became the cruelest amusement of Tzeentch. For the architect of fate thrives not in destruction alone, but in torment prolonged. The warp itself bent around Magnus as a reflection of his torment. Where he strode, reality grew thin, revealing glimpses of what might have been, visions of Prospero unburned, of the Emperor embracing him as son, of brothers who did not scorn him. These illusions lured him like ghosts, always vanishing when reached for. To his followers, they were omens, prophecies of futures yet to come. But to Magnus, they were wounds reopened endlessly. Such is the way of the changer of ways, to grant sight not as clarity, but as punishment. Magnus could see every future, every possibility, every fragment of truth, except the one he longed for. The Imperium's wars with the Thousand Sons were never battles of steel alone. Wherever Magnus's sorcerers moved, knowledge itself became a weapon. Inquisitors sent to purge his cults found their memories rewritten, their faith twisted into paradox. Astropaths who intercepted his whispers bled from their eyes as their minds were drowned in endless fractals of fire. Even those who fought and survived bore scars unseen, doubts that lingered, questions that festered, heresies that whispered in the quiet of prayer. Magnus's war was not fought in flesh and blood, but in the soul and the mind. His legion's weapons were not bolters and blades, but words, visions, and dreams. In all this, the Emperor remained the wound that would not heal. For though Magnus had embraced demonhood, though he had bargained his soul and cursed his bloodline, he still longed for his father's recognition. Witnesses across the millennia claim to have heard Magnus cry out in battlefields, not with curses, but with laments, begging the Emperor to see him, to understand, to forgive. Some say he speaks even to the Golden Throne, whispering through the tides of the warp, though the Emperor never answers. Perhaps the Master of mankind cannot hear. Perhaps he will not. Perhaps silence itself is the punishment. And yet, there are forbidden texts, heretical in every library, which claim that Magnus was right, that the Emperor's denial of sorcery was not wisdom, but fear, that humanity's only path to survival lies in embracing the warp, not fleeing from it. If this is true, then Magnus's tragedy is not merely personal, but civilizational, for he was condemned for being the herald of the very destiny mankind must one day accept. And so the Imperium may one day fall not because Magnus betrayed it, but because it rejected him. This is the horror of his legacy, that both sides may be wrong, and in their opposition, mankind is doomed. The Imperium clings to faith and denies the warp. Magnus embraces the warp and loses his soul. Between these poles, there is no salvation, only ruin. Magnus's story is not only that of one Primarch, but of mankind itself. Pride, brilliance, loyalty, betrayal, punishment, grief. These are not merely the themes of his existence, but the eternal pattern of the 41st millennium. The Imperium consumes its brightest suns, and chaos twists their ruins into weapons. None escape, none are spared. In Magnus, one sees the futility of resistance against fate, for he was carved by the Emperor's own hand, designed as a weapon of vision and wisdom, placed upon a throne of knowledge. And yet even he was broken, his loyalty twisted, his brilliance devoured. If such is the fate of a demigod, what then for the common man? What chance for the soldier pressed into endless war, or the psyker shackled to the black ships, or the child born into hive-world despair? None. If a Primarch cannot escape, no soul can. And so the galaxy drifts deeper into shadow, haunted by the crimson eye of Magnus the Red, a figure both monstrous and mournful, both heretic and son, a demon who yet weeps, for in the grim darkness of the far future, even the gods cry, but their tears burn worlds to ash. The tale of Magnus the Red did not end in the fires of Prospero, nor in the shackles of demonhood. It stretched on, a bleeding wound across the millennia, shaping wars, schemes, and destinies that even the emperor himself could not prevent. For Magnus was not only a son betrayed, but a living embodiment of the warp's patience. Time meant little to him now. Decades, centuries, millennia, all were but fragments of a great pattern in which he was both pawn and player. When the great rift tore the galaxy in half, when the cicatrix maledictum split reality itself, Magnus rose again into the vision of mankind. He was no longer whispered of only as a shadow in the eye of terror. He strode openly into the material realm, his form towering above cities, his single great eye blazing with warp fire that turned night into endless dawn. To mortals who beheld him, he was indistinguishable from a god. And in truth, he was. For what else is a god, if not a figure who commands reality, who bends the will of the universe to his own? Magnus brought fire upon the Imperium, not only through his 1,000 sons, but through the very air men breathed. Whole regiments of Astra Militarum collapsed in madness before his presence, their commanders raving as their soldiers clawed at their own eyes to escape visions of endless futures. Space Marines, paragons of loyalty and resilience, faltered before him, their gene-forged courage drowned beneath waves of sorcery. For to fight Magnus was to fight inevitability itself. On Fenris, the world of his hated brother Leman Russ, Magnus struck with vengeance forged in centuries of sorrow. The Space Wolves, who had once reduced Prospero to ash, found their own sanctum invaded by warp storms and sorcerous fire. Great halls split apart as though struck by the fists of gods. The seas boiled into storms of blood. From the skies descended Magnus, no longer the broken king of Prospero, but the ascendant crimson sorcerer, his wings blotting out the heavens. For the sons of Russ, it was retribution written in fire. For Magnus, it was tragedy reenacted, vengeance that brought no peace, no closure. Even as his sorcery tore through the wolves, even as he brought low their monuments, the wound within him did not heal. For vengeance is hollow when born of grief that has no end. The Imperium declared Magnus one of its greatest enemies, a figure to be reviled alongside Horus, Abaddon, and the arch-traitors of history. And yet, unlike many of those figures, Magnus's motives were never so simple as lust for power. He did not seek dominion for its own sake, nor destruction out of hunger alone. His tragedy lay in the fact that he still believed himself, in fragments, in shadows, to be right. He believed that mankind could not hide forever from the warp. He believed that knowledge, even dark knowledge, was the only true salvation. And in this belief, he became both heretic and prophet. The changer of ways used this conviction as a weapon. For Tzeentch does not need slaves who know they are slaves. He thrives upon servants who believe themselves free. Magnus, in his brilliance and his sorrow, remained bound because he thought himself still fighting for truth. The schemes of the Crimson Sorcerer rippled across centuries, not as crude wars, but as manipulations of thought, politics, and faith. Cults rose across the galaxy, whispering of knowledge hidden by the Imperium, of truths denied by priests and inquisitors. Tomes of forbidden sorcery spread like disease, infecting scholars, psychers, and desperate men who sought salvation in understanding. All of it served Magnus, whether he willed it or not, for every seeker who embraced forbidden lore walked deeper into Tzeentch's labyrinth. The thousand suns themselves, though silenced and hollowed, became avatars of inevitability. On battlefields, they marched in perfect silence, rubric marines whose bolters roared without passion, whose armor clattered without breath. Against them, even seasoned warriors of the Imperium faltered, unnerved by their stillness, their lack of cries, their absence of humanity. To fight them was to fight statues animated by grief, puppets whose strings were pulled by sorcerers, chanting words older than stars. The scarab occult and exalted sorcerers, Magnus's chosen, wove destinies in fire and shadow, unraveling entire campaigns not with armies, but with a single phrase, a single thought planted in the wrong mind at the right time. On the world of Sortiarius, where the planet of the sorcerers anchored itself within the warp, Magnus's throne loomed eternal. It was said that within his sanctum, Magnus gazed endlessly into the weave of futures, his cyclopean eye scanning strands of possibility beyond mortal comprehension. Those who glimpsed him there claimed that he no longer resembled even the demon prince he had once become. His form shifted with each heartbeat, now winged titan, now burning giant, now a figure of crimson robes and a single mournful eye. For Magnus was not one thing. He was all things he might have been, bound together by torment. The Crimson King, the Crimson Sorcerer, the Scholar, the Heretic, the Sun, the Monster. Yet in all these guises, the same sorrow remained. The same voice whispered laments for Prospero, for his sons, for the father who cast him aside. It is said that in his most private moments, Magnus curses not the Emperor, nor Russ, nor even Horus, but himself, for he knows that every tragedy of his existence was birthed by his own hand. His own pride shattered the webway, his own hubris damned Prospero, his own bargain erased his sons. The hand of Tzeentch guided him, yes, but it was Magnus who chose to play the game. That knowledge, that unbearable clarity, is his eternal torment. And still, the galaxy burns with his schemes. During the great wars of the Indomitus Crusade, Magnus struck at worlds not for conquest, but for knowledge. He sought artifacts, tomes, fragments of truth hidden even from the Emperor. Each was woven into his grand design, a design whose shape none could see but him. Some among his followers whisper that he still seeks reconciliation with the Emperor, that his schemes are not to dethrone the master of mankind, but to heal him. Others claim he seeks to supplant him, to become the god mankind truly deserves. In the labyrinth of Magnus's mind, both may be true, and that ambiguity is the most dangerous weapon of all. For Magnus is not a simple villain, nor a tyrant whose desires can be predicted. He is a wound that thinks, a tragedy that schemes, a grief that dreams of eternity. To fight him is to fight not only a demon, but the very idea that knowledge itself is forbidden. To resist him is to resist the truth that the Imperium itself survives only by lies. And this is why he endures, why he cannot be killed, why his name echoes across millennia. For Magnus embodies not only sorcery, but doubt, and doubt is a plague the Imperium can never cure. The galaxy remembers him as traitor, as monster, as demon. But beneath those titles lingers the truth that terrifies even the gods. Magnus is still, in fragments, a son who loved too much, who sought too much, who hoped too much. And it is hope, not hatred, that the warp twists most cruelly. For in the grim darkness of the far future, even hope is a weapon, and it cuts deeper than any blade. Magnus the Red endures. Across 10,000 years, across a galaxy drowned in fire and ruin, he remains, not as the man he was, not as the king of Prospero, but as the Crimson Sorcerer, chained eternally to the labyrinth of the warp. He is no longer flesh, no longer son, no longer even brother. He is an idea given form, a fragment of grief wrapped in the skin of a god, a reminder that even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. The Imperium calls him heretic and fiend. They raise statues of Russ, the executioner who burned Prospero, and speak of him as loyal son and savior. They chant curses against Magnus in their liturgies, blaming him for shattering the Emperor's grand design. Yet the truth, whispered in forbidden corners, is far more cruel. Magnus was loyal, too loyal, loyal even when loyalty doomed him. His fall was not born of rebellion, but of devotion twisted by pride, of faith expressed in the wrong form, of a desperate son trying to save a father who could not be saved. And this is why his story remains so haunting. For most traitors fall because they choose hatred. Horus fell because of envy and corruption, Fulgrim for vanity, Perturabo for bitterness, Angron for rage. But Magnus fell because he loved, because he believed, because he hoped. His tragedy is not rebellion, but faith. On Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers, Magnus sits upon a throne of impossible stone. His cyclopean eye surveys futures that unravel endlessly before him. In one strand, he sees himself reconciled with the Emperor, embraced once more as son. In another, he sees himself strike down Terra, standing triumphant atop the ruins of the throne. In still others, he sees himself undone, slain by Russ reborn, or erased from existence by some yet unborn god. He sees all these things and more, futures where Prospero never burned, where the webway remained intact, where mankind embraced the warp and rose to godhood. He sees them all and knows that none can be, for the past is written in blood, and no sorcery, no vision, no bargain can undo what has been done. And so he weeps, a god who weeps. His tears are not water but fire, each drop burning the ground into glass. His grief is eternal, but so too is his fury. For while he mourns, he also hates. He hates the Imperium that branded him traitor. He hates Russ, whose fangs tore his city to ash. He hates his father, whose silence condemned him to damnation. But most of all, he hates himself. For in the endless spirals of time, he alone sees with clarity that every step of his ruin was his own. No demon forced his hand. No brother betrayed him first. He chose, and in choosing, he damned all he loved. The 1,000 suns march still, hollow and silent, their armor echoing across battlefields like funeral bells. Their sorcerers weave fire and shadow in Magnus's name, though whether they serve out of loyalty or compulsion, none can truly say. The rubric Marines do not answer. They never will. Their silence is the epitaph of Prospero. Every step they take is a reminder that Magnus, in saving his sons, killed them. And still they follow him, not because they can, but because they must. The Imperium fights him still, as it fights all things, with fire and steel and faith. Inquisitors burn whole worlds at the whisper of his name. Space Marine chapters hunt his sorcerers across the stars. Saints and relics are raised to resist him, prayers shouted into the void to ward against his gaze. And yet, he endures. For how do you kill a man who has become an idea? How do you destroy grief itself? Even the gods of chaos do not trust him fully. To them, Magnus is both servant and rival, pawn and threat. Tzeentch delights in his torment, shaping his every scheme into another step in the endless dance of fate. But the Crimson Sorcerer is no fool. He knows he is a prisoner, knows his so-called power is a leash gilded in illusion. And still, he schemes. Still, he dreams of freedom. even knowing freedom is impossible. His rebellion is not against the Imperium alone, but against destiny itself. Yet in the 41st millennium, rebellion against fate is as futile as rebellion against death. And so Magnus's story spirals on, without end, without resolution. He is forever the son who sought to save and destroyed instead. Forever the king who ruled a world of scholars and left only dust. Forever the father who saved his sons by erasing their souls. Forever the loyalist damned as traitor, the traitor remembered as heretic, the heretic who yet weeps as son. There are those who say that Magnus will play a final role in the fate of mankind. Some whisper that when the emperor finally falls, Magnus will stand beside him either as executioner or as savior. Others claim he will betray even Tzeentch, breaking free from his chains to seize godhood for himself. And still others say he will fade into nothing, consumed by the very grief that sustains him. But these are only stories, and Magnus knows better than any that stories are the cruelest illusions of all. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there are no endings. Only wounds that never heal. Only tragedies that repeat themselves in endless spirals. Magnus the Red will not be redeemed. He will not be destroyed. He will not be forgotten. He will endure, as all tragedies endure, because the galaxy itself thrives on ruin. And so his eye remains open, burning across eternity, gazing not only upon the warp, but upon us all. A reminder carved into the bones of history that knowledge is dangerous, that hope is fatal, that love is a weapon sharper than any blade. His story is not comfort, it is warning. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the Sorcerer of Prospero, the son who loved too much and in loving lost everything. In the end, his truth is the truth of all mankind, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no peace, no forgiveness, no salvation, only sorrow eternal, burning like a crimson eye across the endless night.